The funeral procession wound through the slave quarters of Willowbrook Plantation in Virginia on a cold February morning in 1856. 40 enslaved workers walked slowly behind a simple pine coffin, their breath visible in the frigid air, their voices raised in a mournful spiritual. "Swing low, sweet chariot coming for to carry me home." Inside the coffin lay Sara Sutton, a 15-year-old girl who died 3 days earlier from what the plantation doctor had called fever and consumption. She'd been sick for weeks, growing progressively weaker, until she'd finally stopped breathing in the early hours of February 10th. Her mother, Rachel, walked directly behind the coffin, supported by 2 other women who kept her from collapsing. Rachel's grief was absolute. Sara had been her only surviving child, the last connection to Rachel's husband who'd been sold away 7 years earlier. Master Edmund Whitmore watched the procession from the big house veranda, his expression a mixture of annoyance and calculation. Sara had been a house servant, skilled in sewing and child care. Her death represented a financial loss, perhaps $400 in value, that Whitmore would have to recoup by purchasing a replacement worker. "Shame about the girl," Whitmore said to his wife, Catherine. "She was useful, but consumption takes who it takes. At least it wasn't something contagious that could spread through the whole workforce." Catherine Whitmore said nothing, but her expression was troubled. She'd been present when Sara died, had seen the girl take her last breath, had helped prepare the body for burial. But something about Sara's death had bothered Catherine, something she couldn't articulate but that nagged at her consciousness. The funeral procession reached the slave cemetery at the edge of Willowbrook's property. The grave had been dug the previous day, a deep hole in the frozen ground, excavated with enormous effort by 2 enslaved men who'd worked through the night. Reverend Thomas, a traveling black preacher who served several plantations in the area, spoke over Sara's coffin. His words were a mixture of Christianity and African spiritual traditions, offering comfort to the grieving community. "Sister Sara has gone to her rest," Reverend Thomas intoned. "She suffered in this world, but now she's free. Free from labor, free from sorrow, free from the chains that bound her here. She's with the Lord now, and we'll see her again when we cross over to that other shore." Rachel sobbed uncontrollably. The finality of burial, the reality that she'd never see her daughter again, crushed her with overwhelming grief. The coffin was lowered into the grave. Workers began shoveling frozen dirt onto the pine box, the sound of earth hitting wood echoing across the cemetery. And then, impossibly, a sound came from inside the coffin. A knock, then another, then scratching, frantic scratching from inside the buried box. The workers froze, shovels suspended mid-motion. Everyone stared at the grave in shocked silence. "Someone's in there," whispered one of the workers. "Someone's alive in that coffin." Rachel screamed and lunged toward the grave. "Sara, my baby, she's alive. Get her out, get her out." Chaos erupted. Workers dropped their shovels and began frantically digging, throwing dirt aside with their hands, desperate to reach the coffin before whoever was inside suffocated. On the veranda, Edmund Whitmore stood frozen in disbelief. "That's impossible. The girl was dead. I saw her body. The doctor confirmed death." "Then how is she knocking?" Catherine asked, her voice shaking. "Edmund, that's Sara in there. She's alive. Oh God, we buried her alive." The workers reached the coffin and pried it open with desperate strength. And there, gasping and clawing at the inside of the box, was Sara Sutton. She was alive. Her face was pale, her breathing labored, but she was undeniably, impossibly alive. She looked up at the faces surrounding the grave with confused, terrified eyes. "Mama," Sara whispered. "What happened? Why am I in a box? Why is everyone crying?" Rachel collapsed into the grave, pulling Sara into her arms, sobbing with relief and shock and overwhelming joy. "You're alive. Oh my God, baby, you're alive. We thought you were dead. You stopped breathing. You were cold. We thought we'd lost you." Workers pulled both Sara and Rachel from the grave, lifting them out carefully. Sara was weak, disoriented, but clearly conscious and aware. "I don't understand," Sara said, her voice trembling. "I remember being sick. I remember feeling so cold and tired, and then, nothing, just darkness, and then I woke up and I couldn't breathe and I was trapped and—" She broke down, the trauma of waking in a buried coffin overwhelming her. The crowd of enslaved workers stood in stunned silence, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. They'd buried Sara Sutton. They'd mourned her death. They'd sung spirituals of. or her grave, and now she was alive, standing among them, gasping and confused but undeniably living. "It's a miracle," Reverend Thomas said, his voice filled with awe. "The Lord has brought this child back from death. She was in the grave and he raised her up. Praise God, we've witnessed a resurrection." Some of the workers fell to their knees, praying and weeping. Others simply stared, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. A few backed away, frightened. In their experience, death was final, and someone returning from a grave suggested supernatural forces they didn't understand. Edmund Whitmore approached the grave, his practical mind struggling with the impossible situation. The doctor pronounced her dead. He checked for breath, for heartbeat. He said she was gone. "Then the doctor was wrong," Catherine said. "Edmund, that girl was alive the entire time. We put a living person in a coffin. If the burial had been earlier, if the ground had been softer, if the workers had filled the grave faster, she would have suffocated. We almost killed her." The horror of that realization silenced everyone. They'd been moments away from murdering Sara Sutton through a medical mistake, from burying alive a 15-year-old girl who'd simply been in some kind of unconscious state rather than actually dead. "Get her to the house," Whitmore ordered, recovering his composure. "Warm her up, feed her, make sure she's actually stable, and someone fetch the doctor. I want an explanation for how he declared a living person dead." Sara was carried to the house, still weak and disoriented. Catherine Whitmore personally supervised her care, directing servants to warm the girl, provide food and water, and ensure she recovered from her ordeal. Over the next hours, as Sara gradually regained strength and coherence, she began describing what she remembered, or rather, what she didn't remember. "I remember being sick," Sara said, wrapped in blankets near the kitchen fire. "So tired, everything hurt, I couldn't stay awake, and then, I don't remember anything. No dreams, no awareness, just absence, like I blinked and time disappeared. The last thing I remember clearly was 3 days ago. Now you're telling me I died and was buried." "The doctor said you'd stopped breathing," Catherine explained gently. "No pulse, no signs of life. We waited 6 hours to be certain, Sara. We didn't rush the burial. We truly believed you were gone." "But I wasn't dead," Sara said, her voice rising with distress. "I was alive the whole time, trapped in my own body, unable to move or speak or show I was still here. And then I woke up in darkness, in a box, underground, and I thought I'd been sent to hell for something I didn't understand." The trauma in her voice was evident. Being buried alive was every person's nightmare, a horror beyond comprehension. The psychological damage from such an experience would be profound and lasting. When the doctor arrived later that afternoon, a white physician named Dr. Marcus Reynolds, who served several plantations in the area, he was defensive and alarmed. "I checked her thoroughly," Dr. Reynolds insisted. "No breath, no pulse, skin cold, eyes fixed. Every indication of death was present. She'd been declining for weeks from consumption. Death was expected." "Yet she wasn't dead," Whitmore said coldly. "You declared a living person deceased, doctor. If that grave had been filled faster, if the burial had been 1 day earlier, my property would be genuinely dead now because of your error." Dr. Reynolds examined Sara carefully, checking her vital signs, listening to her breathing, testing her responsiveness. "Her pulse is weak but present. Her breathing is shallow but functional. Her temperature is subnormal but stable. I don't understand. These signs weren't present 3 days ago. I'm certain of it." "Are you familiar with catalepsy?" Catherine Whitmore asked. She'd been reading medical texts, unusual for a woman, but Catherine had intellectual interests her husband merely tolerated. "A condition where a person falls into a death-like state. Breathing and heartbeat become so faint they're undetectable by ordinary examination." Dr. Reynolds looked uncomfortable. "Catalepsy is rare and poorly understood. It's mentioned in medical literature, but I've never encountered a case. If Sara experienced catalepsy, it would explain the appearance of death, but such cases are extraordinarily uncommon." "Yet apparently not impossible," Catherine said. "Doctor, this girl was hours away from being suffocated in her grave because you couldn't distinguish between catalepsy and death. What procedures should you have followed to prevent such a mistake?" The question hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Dr. Reynolds had no good answer. Medical knowledge in 1856 was limited, diagnostic tools were primitive, and mistakes like this, while rare, did happen. But the fact remained, Sara Sutton had been buried. Yet alive, had nearly died in her grave. and had only survived through luck and the frozen ground that had slowed the burial process. News of Sara's resurrection spread rapidly through the enslaved communities of Virginia. Within days, people were traveling from neighboring plantations to see the girl who'd come back from the dead, to touch her, to verify she was real. Some saw it as a religious miracle, proof of God's power, evidence of divine intervention. Others whispered about supernatural explanations, voodoo, spirits, forces beyond Christian understanding. But for Sara herself, the experience was deeply traumatic. She'd survived, but she was haunted by the memory of waking in that coffin, by the darkness and the terror and the certainty that she was going to die slowly, trapped underground. "I can't sleep," Sara told her mother a week after the burial. "Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in that box. I'm suffocating, I'm clawing at wood, I'm screaming and no one hears me." Rachel held her daughter, offering comfort she didn't know how to provide. How did you help someone recover from being buried alive? What words could possibly address such trauma? "You're safe now," Rachel said, though the words felt inadequate. "You're alive, you're here, that's what matters." But Sara knew something Rachel didn't, something she hadn't told anyone yet, something impossible and terrifying that she'd discovered in the days following her resurrection. Because Sara Sutton hadn't just survived being buried alive. Something else had happened to her during those 3 days of apparent death. Something that defied explanation, and that would change her life, and the lives of everyone around her, in ways no one could have anticipated. Sara had come back different, and within weeks, everyone at Willowbrook Plantation would discover just how different she'd become. 3 weeks after her burial and resurrection, Sara Sutton was working in the Whitmore house when something impossible happened. She was in the kitchen, helping prepare dinner, when Catherine Whitmore entered and stumbled slightly on an uneven floorboard. Catherine caught herself before falling, but as she steadied herself, Sara suddenly gasped and grabbed her own ankle. "Are you all right, Sara?" Catherine asked. Sara stared at her ankle in confusion. I felt pain in my ankle, the same place where you almost twisted yours, but I didn't actually hurt myself, I just felt what you felt." Catherine looked at Sara with concern. "You felt my pain." "Not exactly pain," Sara said slowly, trying to articulate something she didn't understand. "More like an echo of what you experienced, a shadow of the sensation. For just a second, I felt what you felt when you stumbled." Catherine dismissed it as coincidence or imagination. The girl was still recovering from her traumatic experience, probably experiencing strange psychological aftereffects. But Sara knew it wasn't imagination. She'd felt something, some connection to Catherine's physical experience that shouldn't have been possible. Over the following days, similar incidents occurred. Sara would flinch when people near her were startled. She'd tear up when someone else cried, even before seeing their tears. She'd tense when people were angry, sensing their emotions before they displayed them. It was as if Sara had developed some kind of heightened sensitivity to other people's physical and emotional states, as if the boundary between her experiences and others' experiences had become permeable. "Mama, something's wrong with me," Sara told Rachel one evening. "Since I came back, I can feel things I shouldn't be able to feel. Other people's pain, their emotions, their sensations. It's like I'm connected to everyone around me in a way I wasn't before." Rachel looked troubled. "You're saying you can feel what other people feel?" "Not always, not completely. But yes, sometimes I know what people are experiencing without them telling me. I know when someone's in pain or frightened or sad, even when they're hiding it. It's overwhelming, Mama. There are so many people here, and I can feel fragments of all of them." Rachel's first instinct was to tell Sara to keep this ability secret. In 1856 Virginia, enslaved people who displayed unusual abilities or who seemed different in supernatural ways often faced suspicion, fear, or violence. If white people thought Sara was strange or dangerous, there was no telling what they might do. "Don't tell anyone," Rachel warned. "Especially not Master Whitmore or the doctor. They already think your survival was strange. If they think you've come back wrong somehow, if they think you're possessed or corrupted, Sara, I can't protect you from what they might do." Sara agreed to stay silent, but keeping her new sensitivity secret became increasingly difficult as it continued developing and intensifying. She began knowing things she shouldn't know. She'd predict when someone was about to arrive before seeing them. She'd sense when people were lying or hiding something. She'd wake in the night with the certainty that someone on the plantation was suffering, and would find out the next day that a worker had been injured or a child had been sick during those exact hours. It was as if Sara's period of apparent death had somehow opened her consciousness to perceptions beyond normal human awareness, as if she'd returned from that death-like state with abilities that defied natural explanation. A month after the burial, Sara had an experience that convinced her this sensitivity wasn't just heightened empathy or intuition. It was something genuinely inexplicable. She was in the slave quarters one evening when she suddenly felt overwhelming terror and pain. The sensations were so intense that Sara collapsed, gasping and clutching her chest. "Someone's dying," Sara said with absolute certainty. "Someone's in terrible pain, they're frightened. They're at the north field, near the creek. Something's wrong, someone needs help." The other workers looked at her skeptically. How could she possibly know someone was in trouble at a location half a mile away that she couldn't see or hear? But Rachel, seeing the conviction in her daughter's face, organized several workers to check the north field. They found a young man named Thomas who'd been injured by a falling tree branch, pinned under heavy wood, bleeding in severe pain, exactly as Sara had described. Thomas was rescued and his injuries treated. He survived, though he would have died if help hadn't arrived when it did. "How did you know?" people asked Sara afterward. "How could you possibly know Thomas was hurt?" Sara had no explanation that made sense. "I felt it. I felt his pain and fear like they were my own. I just knew he was in trouble." The incident generated intense discussion in the enslaved community. Some people began viewing Sara as gifted, someone who'd been touched by divine power, who'd been given special abilities for a purpose. Others were frightened, worried that Sara had brought something unnatural back from her near-death experience. "She died and came back wrong," some whispered. "She's not fully human anymore, she's something else." "She's been touched by God," others insisted, "given the gift of knowing so she can help people." Sara heard both interpretations and didn't know which, if either, was true. She only knew that she'd changed, that something fundamental about her consciousness had been altered during those 3 days of apparent death. Catherine Whitmore also noticed Sara's changes, though she interpreted them differently than the enslaved community did. Catherine had been observing Sara carefully since the resurrection, partly from medical curiosity and partly from genuine concern for the girl's well-being. She noticed Sara's ability to anticipate needs, to sense emotions, to know things she shouldn't be able to know. And Catherine, who'd read extensively about medical and psychological phenomena, began suspecting Sara was experiencing what some medical literature called heightened consciousness, or supernatural perception, abilities that occasionally emerged in people who'd survived near-death experiences. "Sara, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly," Catherine said during a private conversation. "Since your resurrection, have you noticed changes in yourself, abilities you didn't have before?" Sara hesitated, remembering her mother's warning to stay silent. But Catherine's tone was curious rather than accusatory, and Sara sensed, through her new sensitivity, that Catherine's interest was scientific rather than threatening. "Yes, ma'am," Sara admitted. "I can feel what other people feel. I know things about people without being told. I sense when people are in pain or danger even when they're far away. I don't understand it, but it's real." Catherine's eyes widened with fascination rather than fear. "That's extraordinary. Sara, there are documented cases in medical literature of people developing enhanced sensitivity after surviving catalepsy or near-death states. The prevailing theory is that the experience of being suspended between life and death somehow expands consciousness, opens perceptions that are normally closed." "Is there a name for it?" Sara asked. "Some physicians call it heightened somatic awareness or empathic perception. Others use more supernatural language, second sight, or spiritual sensitivity. But regardless of terminology, you're describing real phenomena that have been observed and documented, even if they're not well understood." "Am I dangerous?" Sara asked, voicing her deepest fear. "Am I wrong somehow? People look at me differently now. Some are afraid of me." "You're not dangerous," Catherine said firmly. "You're unusual, certainly. What you're experiencing is rare and remarkable, but Sara, having enhanced. Perceptions doesn't make you wrong or evil. It makes you different, which is frightening to people who don't understand. But difference isn't wrong." Catherine's reassurance helped, but Sara still struggled with her new abilities. The constant flood of other people's emotions and physical sensations was exhausting. She felt perpetually overwhelmed, unable to distinguish her own experiences from the echoes she received from everyone around her. "I don't know how to turn it off," Sara told Catherine during another conversation. "I don't know how to stop feeling everyone else's pain and fear. It's like I'm living 100 lives at once, feeling fragments of everyone's experiences. I'm drowning in sensations that aren't mine." "You need to learn to control it," Catherine said. "To filter the perceptions, to choose what you receive and what you block out. I don't know exactly how that's done. This is beyond my expertise. But Sara, if you don't learn control, this ability will destroy you." Catherine began working with Sara, using techniques drawn from medical texts and from philosophical writings about meditation and consciousness control. They practiced focusing Sara's awareness, teaching her to create mental boundaries between her own experiences and others, showing her how to selectively open and close her sensitivity. The training was difficult and often frustrating, but gradually, over months, Sara began developing some control over her abilities. She learned to quiet her perception when it threatened to overwhelm her. She learned to focus on specific people when she needed information. She learned to function despite the constant background noise of other people's experiences. But as Sara gained control over her abilities, she also began recognizing their potential uses. She could sense when people were in genuine need. She could identify lies and deception. She could predict danger before it manifested. And most importantly, she could help people in ways no one else could, warning them of threats, understanding their unspoken needs, providing comfort by demonstrating she truly understood their suffering. "Maybe this is why I survived," Sara said to her mother 6 months after the burial. "Maybe I was supposed to die but was brought back for a reason. Maybe these abilities are meant to be used to help people." Rachel remained cautious. "Sara, helping people is good, but baby, you need to be careful. If white folks, especially Master Whitmore, realize what you can do, they'll either fear you or try to exploit you. You can't let them know the full extent of your abilities." Sara understood the warning, but she also felt compelled to use her gifts to turn her traumatic experience into something meaningful and helpful. She began discreetly using her abilities to help the enslaved community. When she sensed someone was in danger, she'd warn them. When she knew someone was sick or injured, she'd direct help to them. When she detected deception or betrayal, she'd quietly intervene. People began seeking Sara out, asking for her help, trusting her perceptions. She became an unofficial advisor, a person who knew things others didn't, whose insights could prevent disasters and solve problems. But Sara's growing influence and her inexplicable abilities were about to attract dangerous attention. Because there was someone else on Willowbrook Plantation who'd noticed Sara's changes and was determined to understand and exploit them. Edmund Whitmore had been observing Sara carefully since her resurrection, and he was starting to suspect that the girl who'd come back from the dead might be valuable in ways he'd never anticipated. Edmund Whitmore's initial interest in Sara's abilities was pragmatic and mercenary. He'd heard the stories circulating among the enslaved workers, stories about Sara's uncanny ability to predict events, to know things she shouldn't know, to sense danger and illness before they became obvious. At first, Whitmore dismissed these stories as superstition and exaggeration. But then he began testing Sara informally, asking her questions designed to verify whether she really possessed unusual perceptual abilities. "Sara, my horse has been limping," Whitmore said one morning. "The stable hands can't identify what's wrong. Look at the horse and tell me what you sense." Sara approached the horse cautiously, her sensitivity immediately picking up the animal's discomfort. She placed her hand on the horse's leg and felt an echo of pain radiating from a specific location. "His left front leg, sir, just above the hoof. There's damage to the tendon, a small tear that's causing inflammation and pain. It's not visible yet, but it will become more serious if not treated." Whitmore had a veterinarian examine the horse. The vet confirmed a tendon injury in exactly the location Sara had indicated, an injury so subtle it hadn't been detectable through normal examination. "How did you know, Whittam?" Or demanded, "How could you possibly identify an injury that even the veterinarian couldn't see?" "I don't know, sir," Sara said, which was partially true. She understood that she could sense the horse's pain through her heightened perception, but she couldn't explain the mechanism of how that perception worked. Whitmore's interest intensified. He began testing Sara more systematically, having her diagnose illnesses in enslaved workers, predict whether changes that affected planting decisions, identify which workers were most productive and which were malingering. Sara's accuracy was disturbing and impressive. She could identify illnesses days before symptoms manifested. She could sense when rain was coming with uncanny precision. She could evaluate workers' health and capabilities with insights that surpassed any overseer's observations. "This is remarkable," Whitmore told his wife. "The girl has some kind of unusual perceptual ability, whether medical, psychological, or supernatural, I don't care. What matters is that she's useful, extraordinarily useful." Catherine was troubled by her husband's interest. "Edmund, Sara isn't a tool to be exploited. She's a person who survived a traumatic experience and is dealing with unusual consequences. Using her abilities without her consent, pushing her beyond her limits, it's cruel." "She's my property," Whitmore replied coldly. "Her abilities, whatever their source, belong to me, and I intend to profit from them." Whitmore began hiring Sara out to neighboring plantations, offering her diagnostic services for livestock, enslaved workers, and agricultural decisions. He charged substantial fees, sometimes $50 for a single consultation, and kept all the profits while Sara received nothing. Sara was forced to travel between plantations, examining animals and people, providing insights drawn from her heightened perceptions. The work was exhausting. Each consultation meant opening herself to the physical and emotional states of whoever or whatever she was examining, flooding her consciousness with experiences that weren't hers. "I can't keep doing this," Sara told her mother after a particularly brutal week of consultations. "Master Whitmore is using me like a machine, forcing me to use my abilities constantly, giving me no rest. Every day I'm exposed to dozens of people's pain and suffering. It's destroying me." Rachel was furious and helpless. "He's working you to death, just in a different way than field labor. But baby, I don't know how to stop him. He owns you. Legally, he can do whatever he wants." Catherine Whitmore tried to intervene. "Edmund, you're pushing Sara too hard. These abilities take a toll on her. She needs rest, limits, consideration for her well-being." "She's more valuable than I initially calculated," Whitmore replied. "With her abilities, I can generate more income from her consultations than from any 3 field hands' labor. Why would I limit such a valuable resource?" "Because she's human, not a resource," Catherine said. "Because exploitation will eventually break her, and then you'll lose the abilities you're profiting from." But Whitmore was too focused on the immediate profits to consider long-term consequences. He continued hiring Sara out, pushing her abilities to their limits, treating her as a diagnostic tool rather than a person. The exploitation took a severe toll on Sara. She lost weight, developed chronic headaches, and began experiencing episodes where she'd become completely overwhelmed by the flood of perceptions from people around her. "I can't tell where I end and others begin anymore," Sara confided to Catherine during one of these episodes. "I'm feeling so many people's experiences simultaneously that I'm losing track of my own identity. I don't know whose pain is whose emotions are whose. I'm fragmenting." Catherine recognized this as psychological disintegration. Sara's sense of self was being eroded by the constant exposure to other people's consciousness. If it continued, Sara would suffer a complete mental breakdown. "You need to learn to say no," Catherine told Sara. "To refuse consultations, to protect yourself, to establish boundaries." "How can I refuse?" Sara asked. "Master Whitmore owns me. If I refuse his orders, he'll punish me. He'll hurt Mama. He'll make life unbearable until I comply." Catherine understood the terrible position Sara was in. An enslaved person refusing their owner's orders faced violent retaliation. Sara couldn't simply decline to use her abilities without facing consequences that might be worse than the exploitation itself. But then something happened that changed the dynamic. A wealthy plantation owner from Richmond requested Sara's services for a particularly challenging case and offered Whitmore an extraordinary sum, $500, for a single consultation. The case involved the owner's wife, who'd been suffering from mysterious symptoms that multiple physicians had failed to diagnose. The Richmond owner had heard about Sara's remarkable diagnostic abilities and was willing to pay an unprecedented fee if she could identify what was wrong. Whitmore agreed immediately, seeing an opportunity for substantial profit. He arranged to transport Sara to Richmond for the consultation, not considering that taking Sara to a major city might give her opportunities she didn't have on an isolated plantation. In Richmond, Sara met the sick woman, Mrs. Patricia Harrison, a wealthy white woman in her 40s who'd been declining for months with symptoms that baffled her physicians. Sara extended her sensitivity toward Mrs. Harrison and immediately perceived something unusual. The woman wasn't sick from disease. She was being poisoned. Sara could sense the toxin in Mrs. Harrison's body, could feel the damage it was causing, could identify the symptoms it produced. She could even sense, through her connection to Mrs. Harrison's experiences, fragments of memory about who was administering the poison. But revealing this information was dangerous. Accusing someone of poisoning a wealthy white woman was not something a 15-year-old enslaved girl could do without severe risk. "Ma'am, may I speak with you privately?" Sara asked Mrs. Harrison. Once alone, Sara explained carefully what she'd perceived. "You're being poisoned. Someone you trust is giving you small amounts of toxin regularly, probably in your food or medicine. The poisoner is someone close to you, someone who has easy access to what you consume." Mrs. Harrison's face went pale. "Are you certain?" "Yes, ma'am. I can feel the poison in your body, and I can sense guilt and satisfaction when certain people approach you. Someone is deriving pleasure from your suffering." Sara's heightened perception had picked up emotional resonances that pointed to a specific person, Mrs. Harrison's personal maid, a white woman named Ellen who'd been with the family for years. "Why would Ellen poison me?" Mrs. Harrison asked. "I've treated her well, paid her fairly." "Resentment, ma'am," Sara said quietly. "She resents your wealth, your position, your comfort. I can feel it radiating from her. She's harming you out of class hatred disguised as loyalty." Mrs. Harrison confronted Ellen, who initially denied everything but eventually broke under questioning and admitted to slowly poisoning her employer with small amounts of arsenic. Ellen was arrested and prosecuted. Mrs. Harrison, once the poisoning stopped, recovered completely. The case generated enormous publicity. A 15-year-old enslaved girl had diagnosed a poisoning that multiple trained physicians had missed. She'd solved a mystery and saved a life through inexplicable perceptual abilities. The publicity attracted attention from multiple directions, some positive, some dangerous. Abolitionists in the North heard about Sara and saw her story as evidence that enslaved people possessed intelligence and abilities equal to white people. If an enslaved teenager could outperform trained physicians through natural gifts, it challenged assumptions about racial hierarchy and intellectual capability. Sympathetic journalists published articles about Sara, describing her as the girl who came back from the dead with miraculous abilities, and proof that human capability transcends race and status. But the publicity also attracted less friendly attention. Some Southern physicians and scientists wanted to study Sara to understand the mechanism of her abilities. They saw her not as a person but as a scientific curiosity, a phenomenon to be examined and documented. And Edmund Whitmore, recognizing Sara's increased value and marketability after the Richmond case, became even more exploitative. He raised his consultation fees to enormous sums and began advertising Sara's services throughout Virginia and neighboring states. "You're going to make me wealthy," Whitmore told Sara with satisfaction. "I paid $400 for you years ago. Now I'm earning that much in a single consultation. You're the most profitable investment I've ever made." Sara felt like she was drowning. The exploitation was intensifying, the demands on her abilities were increasing, and she had no agency or control over how her gifts were used. "I wish I'd never come back," Sara told her mother in despair. "I wish I'd stayed dead in that coffin. Death would be better than this." Rachel held her daughter, helpless to protect her but refusing to give up. "Don't say that, baby. You're alive for a reason. These abilities you have, they're a gift, even if cruel people are exploiting them. There has to be a way to use your gifts on your own terms to help people who need it rather than enriching a man who sees you as property." "How?" Sara asked. "How do I escape this? Master Whitmore owns me. He controls my abilities, my life, everything. I'm trapped." But Rachel had been thinking plan. Reaching out to people in the community who might help. And she was about to reveal a plan that would give Sara a chance at something she'd thought was impossible: freedom, and control over her own extraordinary gifts. The plan Rachel had been developing involved people Sara had never met. Abolitionists who'd heard about her story and abilities through the publicity surrounding the Richmond poisoning case. These abolitionists, a network that included freed black people, white sympathizers, and Underground Railroad operatives, saw Sara as someone worth saving. Her abilities were remarkable, but more importantly, her story exemplified slavery's cruelty. A girl with extraordinary gifts was being exploited as property, her abilities used to enrich her owner while she received nothing and suffered under the constant demands placed on her. If they could free Sara and bring her north, she could become a powerful symbol for the abolitionist cause. She could tell her story, demonstrate her abilities, and prove that enslaved people possessed intelligence and gifts that merited respect and freedom. The network's plan was audacious. They would purchase Sara's freedom legally, paying Edmund Whitmore enough money that he couldn't refuse, and then transport Sara to Boston where she'd be beyond Southern reach. The challenge was raising sufficient funds. Whitmore wouldn't sell Sara cheaply. He was profiting enormously from her consultations and wouldn't give up such a valuable asset without substantial compensation. The abolitionists launched a fundraising campaign throughout the North, publishing Sara's story in newspapers and speaking at churches and public gatherings. They described the girl who'd survived being buried alive and had returned with miraculous abilities that she was being forced to use for her owner's profit. This young woman represents both the cruelty of slavery and the remarkable capabilities of black people, one abolitionist speaker told audiences. She has gifts that surpass those of trained physicians, yet she's treated as property, exploited without compensation, worked to exhaustion. We must free her, both because it's just and because her freedom will demonstrate to the world what enslaved people can achieve when given opportunity and agency. The campaign raised money quickly. Donations came from churches, abolitionist societies, wealthy sympathizers, and even some former enslaved people who gave whatever they could afford to help free someone whose story had touched them. Within 6 months, the abolitionists had raised $3,000, an enormous sum in 1856, equivalent to several years' wages for most workers. They sent a representative to Whitmore with an offer, $3,000 in cash for Sara's legal freedom and manumission papers. Whitmore was initially reluctant. "I'm earning hundreds of dollars monthly from her consultations. Why would I accept a one-time payment of $3,000 when she'll generate more than that over several years?" "Because the girl is suffering," the abolitionist representative, a freed black man named Frederick Morris, said bluntly. "You're working her to the point of psychological breakdown. Within a year, she'll be non-functional, mentally shattered by the constant exploitation. You'll lose the abilities you're profiting from. Better to take substantial payment now while she's still valuable." Whitmore recognized the logic, though he resented the implication that his exploitation was destroying Sara. But he was also a practical man who understood that $3,000 in hand was significant capital, while Sara's long-term functionality was uncertain. "$4,000, Whitmore countered. "For $4,000 cash, I'll sell her and provide legal manumission papers." The abolitionists scrambled to raise the additional $1,000. It took another 2 months, but eventually they had the full amount. On December 10, 1856, exactly 10 months after Sara had been buried and resurrected, the transaction was completed. Edmund Whitmore signed manumission papers declaring Sara Sutton a free person, no longer his property. In exchange, he received $4,000 cash. Sara stood in Whitmore's study, holding the papers that declared her freedom, unable to fully process what had happened. She was free. After 15 years of enslavement, after months of exploitation and suffering, she was legally free. "This doesn't mean you can stay here," Whitmore said coldly. "Virginia law requires freed slaves to leave the state within 1 year, and I don't want you on my property spreading ideas about freedom to my remaining workers. You have 1 week to leave Virginia." Sara didn't want to stay. She wanted to be as far from Whitmore and from the plantation as possible. But leaving meant separating from her mother. That night, Sara and Rachel sat together in their cabin, facing the reality that freedom meant separation. "You have to go north," Rachel said, though her voice broke saying it. "You have to go where you're safe, where you can use your abilities on your own terms, where you can tell your story. But Sara, I can't come with you." "Why not?" Sara asked desperately. The abolitionists can buy your freedom too. I'm not as valuable as you, Rachel said gently. I don't have special abilities. Whitmore would charge an enormous sum for me knowing the abolitionist already spent so much on you. And baby, I'm not sure I'm strong enough to start over somewhere new. I'm 43 years old. I've spent my entire life here. This is all I know. So I'm free, but you're still enslaved, Sara said, the injustice of it overwhelming her. That's not freedom, that's torture. It's complicated freedom, Rachel corrected. But Sara, the world needs what you can do. You're going to help people tell your story, prove that black people deserve respect and opportunity. That matters more than us staying together. Your freedom, your real freedom to use your gifts, is worth this sacrifice. They held each other through the night, grieving the separation even as they celebrated Sara's liberation. A week later, Sara left Virginia with Frederick Morris and several other abolitionist operatives. They traveled by train and coach to Boston, where Sara would begin her new life as a free woman. Boston in 1856 was a center of abolitionist activity. Sara was welcomed by a community of freed black people, white abolitionists, and activists who'd followed her story and were eager to support her. She was provided housing, education, and opportunities to develop her abilities under her own control, rather than under exploitation. Catherine Whitmore had arranged something special before Sara left. A letter of introduction to several Boston physicians and to Harvard Medical School faculty members who were interested in studying unusual perceptual abilities from a scientific perspective. Sara, you have something remarkable, Catherine wrote in an accompanying letter to Sara. Don't let it be exploited again, but also don't hide it. Your abilities could advance medical understanding, could help countless people, and could prove that consciousness and perception operate in ways we don't yet understand. Use your gifts, but use them freely. In Boston, Sara began working with physicians and researchers who approached her abilities with respect rather than exploitation. They conducted careful experiments, trying to understand the mechanism of her heightened perception. They discovered that Sara could diagnose illnesses with remarkable accuracy, could sense internal injuries that had no external symptoms, and could identify emotional and psychological states with precision that surpassed any normal empathic ability. Your perceptions appear to operate through a combination of heightened sensory processing and some kind of direct consciousness connection, one Harvard physician explained after months of study. You're receiving information through channels that aren't fully understood, possibly electromagnetic sensitivity, possibly something else entirely. But whatever the mechanism, your abilities are real and extraordinarily valuable. Sara also began speaking publicly about her experiences, telling audiences about her burial and resurrection, about the abilities that had emerged, and about how she'd been exploited under slavery. Her speeches were powerful testimonials about slavery's cruelty and about black capability. She proved, simply by being who she was, that enslaved people possessed intelligence and abilities equal to anyone's. I died and came back different, Sara would tell audiences. But I was always capable of these perceptions. The near-death experience just opened abilities that were dormant. Every enslaved person has hidden capabilities, untapped potential, gifts that slavery crushes and wastes. How many other people like me are working in fields or houses right now, their abilities never discovered or developed because slavery denies them education and opportunity? Her question was rhetorical but powerful. It forced audiences to consider how much human potential was being wasted under slavery, how many gifted people were being exploited or destroyed. Sara also used her abilities to help people directly. She volunteered at hospitals, providing diagnostic insights that saved lives. She worked with escaped slaves who'd reached Boston, using her perceptions to assess their physical and psychological needs. She helped identify Underground Railroad sympathizers who could be trusted and exposed infiltrators who posed dangers. Her gifts, which had been exploited for Edmund Whitmore's profit, became tools for helping people and fighting the system that had oppressed her. In 1859, Sara published a memoir, Buried Alive: How Death Revealed Life's Injustice. The book described her experiences, her apparent death and burial, her resurrection, the development of her abilities, and her exploitation under slavery before being freed by abolitionists. The memoir became a bestseller and was used extensively by abolitionist organizations as evidence for slavery's cruelty and for black capability. This woman survived being buried alive and emerged with abilities that surpass trained physicians, abolitionists would argue. She's proof that black people possess extraordinary potential that slavery wastes and destroys. If we freed and educated all enslaved people, imagine what they could achieve. Sara never saw her mother again. Rachel died at Willowbrook Plantation in 1861, just as the Civil War was beginning. Sara received news of her death weeks after it happened, and the grief was overwhelming. But Sara honored her mother by continuing the work Rachel had believed in, using her freedom and her gifts to fight slavery and to help others. When the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished in 1865, Sara was 34 years old. She'd spent 9 years as a free woman, using her abilities to help people and to advocate for justice. After the war, Sara worked with the Freedmen's Bureau, using her perceptive abilities to identify freed people's needs, to diagnose medical conditions in communities with no access to physicians, and to help establish schools and support systems. She also trained other people who displayed similar sensitivities, teaching them to control and use their abilities without being overwhelmed. She discovered that while her level of ability was unusual, many people possessed some degree of heightened perception that could be developed and refined. "We're all more connected than we realize," Sara would tell her students. "We all sense each other's emotions and physical states to some degree. Most people just aren't consciously aware of it. What I do is simply opening that awareness, paying attention to perceptions most people ignore." Sara died in 1903 at age 62. Having spent 47 years as a free woman, far longer than the 15 years she'd spent enslaved. Her obituary appeared in newspapers across the country, describing her as the woman who came back from the dead with miraculous gifts, whose life proved that human capability transcends race, and that freedom enables extraordinary achievement. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from the community of people Sara had helped throughout her life, the patients she'd diagnosed, the escaped slaves she'd assisted, the students she'd trained. They held a memorial where dozens of people shared stories about how Sara's abilities had saved their lives, identified their illnesses, warned them of dangers, or simply provided comfort by demonstrating that someone truly understood their suffering. "She came back from death different," one speaker said, "but maybe she came back exactly as she was supposed to be, someone whose experiences gave her the ability to perceive and help others in ways most people never could. Her suffering became her gift, her trauma became her strength, and her life proved that even the darkest experiences can be transformed into light if we're brave enough to use them for good." The impossible secret of Sara Sutton, the black girl who came back from the dead, wasn't just that she'd survived being buried alive. The impossible secret was what she'd become through that survival. A woman whose near-death experience had opened perceptions beyond normal human awareness, whose abilities challenged scientific understanding, and whose freedom demonstrated what enslaved people could achieve when given agency over their own extraordinary gifts. She died at 15 and come back different, not wrong, not damaged, but transformed in ways that would allow her to help thousands of people, and to prove that human potential, when freed from oppression and exploitation, could achieve the impossible.